Hi guys, so I am here today to talk to you about ancient poetry. Now, ancient poetry is a massive group of literature. This video is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the genres and authors and just works that are out there from antiquity. Hopefully it will provide a bit of an introduction to the poetry of Greece and Rome from across the centuries and include a selection of genres from epic to didactic to elegy to odes. These are all works that I enjoy and there are far more out there that I haven't mentioned, but hopefully this gives you an idea of somewhere that you might like to start with ancient poetry. I am going to start in chronological order and work from early archaic Greece down to the Roman Empire. And the first work I have to show to you, I'm sure will be of no surprise to many of you, and that is the works of Homer. This is Homer's Iliad. Now, Homer is quite an elusive figure of ancient Greece who's given credit for the first written versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Both of these works are epic poems, which means they are just almost like a modern day long novel but written entirely in verse. The Iliad is split into 24 books, kind of like chapters, and this tells the story of 10 days in the Trojan War, which surrounds the dilemma and the grief and the story of Achilles nearing the end of his life during the Trojan War. Now the Odyssey tells the story post-Trojan War about the warrior Odysseus on his journey home from the war, which has been going on for years, and he's been away from home for a very long time and everyone thinks he's dead. These books you do not need to read Iliad then Odyssey. They are completely separate novels and there is gaps between the Iliad and the Odyssey in the actual historical story. Out of the two, I prefer the Odyssey, but I know people who prefer the Iliad. So it is going to depend on your taste. The Odyssey is more of one man's journey and encounters with various cultures and strange creatures, whereas the Iliad is a sort of war-torn story about the battle between the Achaeans and the Trojans. This translation is by Richmond, Lattimore, and one of the things when it comes to epic is that you can usually get translations both in prose and in verse, but obviously since this is a video about ancient poetry, I wanted to pick translations that kept the poetic style. So Richmond Lattimore just does a fantastic job of translating the Iliad and the Odyssey into a really nice verse that's easy to read in the English, and I'd highly recommend these translations. As you can see, it sort of has that like verse format like that. These really are like some of the most famous pieces of ancient literature out there, poetry or otherwise. Next, I want to mention Pindar. Now, Pindar wrote odes. He wrote the Pythian odes, the Olympian odes. This is his complete odes, and this is an Oxford World Classic edition, translated by Anthony Verity. Now, Pindar's odes basically tell all of the famous Greek myths that you could possibly want to know. If you want a good introduction to Greek myths, then Pindar is an excellent place to start. Each separate ode tells a different myth, but then often the odes go in a sort of chronological order and follow into the next story because so much of Greek mythology is actually very heavily interconnected with one another and one myth leads to the next myth, so it's a really good way to get exposed to them in an almost short story format, so a really easy way to consume them, and I'd highly recommend checking out Pindar. Now next, I could not do a video on ancient poetry without mentioning Sappho. Now Sappho is the only female Greek poet who survives from ancient Greece that we know of, and she is phenomenal, not because she's a woman but because her poetry is epic, and she does just show there were women in antiquity and they were doing something behind the scenes even if they're not recorded. This is a selection of most of her poetry, translated by Mary Bernard, published by the University of California Press. Really gorgeous little edition, this one, and very short, easy to consume. Sappho is perfect for lovers of modern and ancient poetry. Her poetry is much more of a traditional sort of one-page short little poems like this, often either love poems or on the topic of lust or on the topic of family, rather than telling the myths of old like Homer and Pindar. So highly recommend checking out Sappho if you want an easy introduction to Sappho that is not going to cost you much. Penguin actually have an 80p classic which has actually quite a big selection of her poetry in it, and it's called Come Close, and this is excellent, really easy to consume, really nice to read, and her poetry is gorgeous, so would highly recommend checking out this. Moving swiftly on to the Hellenistic period in ancient Greece, I want to talk about Theocritus's Idylls. These are some of my favourite ancient Greek poems. Theocritus wrote under the Ptolemaic dynasty in Alexandria after Alexander the Great died. He wrote individual poems poems, often a few pages long, and they are really, really easy and fun and gorgeous to read. They are just really great. And a lot of them focus on bucolic and pastoral themes, which means the countryside, and it's during this period in Greek history where there's not a disinterest in epic, but there is a change in the interest of literature, and people are looking at the more mundane, the more ordinary life, less about the Greek heroes and more about the ordinary people of ancient Greece. And in this case, the merging of ancient Egyptian and Greek culture in Alexandria. And he tells stories of people on their farms, but also people's everyday lives in the city of Alexandria. So it's also a really interesting historical text, as well as just some beautiful poetry. And he does sneak in some cyclopses here and there as well. But there's far more ancient Greek poetry than that. And another book I just want to quickly mention in this video is Greek Lyric Poetry, a new translation by M.L. West, published by Oxford World Classics, which just has a massive selection of Sappho, Simonides, and various poets who only have very small snippets of their work surviving. So an interesting one to check out if you want quite a bit of an array there. But now it is time to move on to the Romans and Latin poetry. Again, like I said, this is not all of Latin poetry. I have decided to forgo Virgil in this instance because I said that I was picking works I liked. So the next poet I want to mention is Lucretius, who wrote the De Rerum Natura, or The Nature of Things, which is actually a philosophical didactic poem in the kind of epic style, in that it is one long continuous poem separated into 6 books. But in this instance, the didactic name comes from the fact that its purpose is to teach, and Lucretius is teaching the philosophy of Epicureanism in this book, which was originally a Greek philosophy that centred around the theory of atoms and enjoying a simple life and abandoning fear of the gods and fear of death, and that is what this is about. So a little bit more of non-fiction, although it is very much like theoretical, hypothetical philosophy, but so fascinating. I love this poem. I think it's incredibly interesting if you're interested in ancient science, ancient philosophy, ancient politics, or ancient poetry. And this one's quite funny because the original founder of Epicureanism, Epicurus, hated poetry, but Lucretius, a few hundred years later, decided he would write a poem on Epicurean philosophy. But I thought I would mention that that Penguin translation also comes in a gorgeous cloth-bound edition, translated by Stallings, and just if you're looking for a slightly more decorative edition, then this Penguin cloth-bound is gorgeous, and it's the exact same translation. I could not do this video without mentioning some Ovid. Now Ovid has quite the prolific selection of works. It's his love poems I want to concentrate on because I think they're probably one of the best introductions to Ovid, and also just a fantastic place to start with ancient poetry. Here I have the Oxford World Classic Edition translation, which is called The Love Poems, translated by Melville. And the one I tend to go for is the Penguin translation, which is titled The Erotic Poems, and is translated by Peter Green. Now this has 2 of Ovid's works in here. It has the Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, which again is one long poem, kind of again in the didactic style with the aim of teaching. It's separated into 3 chapters and is about the art of love. It teaches men where to pick up women, how to keep a mistress, and also women how to keep their men happy. And it's quite satirical and tongue-in-cheek, and pokes fun at itself and all of the ideas surrounding relationships in ancient Rome. It's so funny. Ovid is very, very funny. And although on the surface quite misogynistic, it is a lot deeper than that, and you have to pick up on a lot of the contradictions and the kind of embedded jokes that Ovid's put in there. Not that he's a feminist by any means, but it's not as simple as you might think. And the other collection of poems is in here are his Amores, which are more short poems, more like the works of Sappho. They're love elegies, from Ovid's own experience of the dating world, to women that he was with, to women that scorned him, and were written before The Art of Love. And last but not least, since we're on the topic of love elegy, I want to mention Catullus, another Latin love elegiast. He actually precedes Ovid. Probably should have put him in before Ovid. He is earlier than Ovid, and he wrote love poetry, quite often about his own lover, Lesbia, and his poems are quite when I say they're love elegy, they're not particularly romantic. They're quite obscene and vulgar, which a lot of Latin like literature can be, but in quite like a witty and clever and funny way. So definitely recommend Catullus. I don't know anybody that doesn't enjoy Catullus, and again, he's another that you can get in a Penguin 80p classic in a collection called I Hate and I Love, which is just another selection of Catullus's poetry if you want a brief introduction to his works. Again, much like Sappho, they're just quite short little poems that don't take up much space, and these are incredibly quick to get through. But this video is 20 minutes long, and I don't want it to be 20 minutes long because it's supposed to be like a brief introduction, so I'm going to go and try and edit it down. I am sorry that I couldn't mention everybody. I'm sure you understand. So please check out any of these works that sound interesting to you. None of them are exclusive to people that are already familiar with ancient works. They all have their own merit and are all perfect places to start. So if any of them sound of interest to you, then please go and pick them up. I will have all of them linked down in the down bar so they're easier to find if you can pick up any of the titles in this video. And until next time guys, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye!